Diplomacy World drops, countdown bubble pops, and Nolan shows her chops. I'm David Hood of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Deadline July 2022. For our feature story, what are you trying to accomplish when you play the game of diplomacy? 18 centers for a solo? Absolutely. Topping the board with the most centers? Of course. Being part of the draw? Sure. Why not? That's all fine and dandy, except what do you have to play for when you are a smaller power, unlikely to score well, and not in control of your own destiny? In The Gamer's Guide to Diplomacy, published by Avalon Hill, hobby writer Rod Walker first coined the phrase playing the small time when he described how players with few centers on the board could still affect the overall course of the game and, most importantly, still have fun. Since all of us end up in this position on the board at some point, we should think more about how to play the small time position. Later in the broadcast, we'll hear from a panel of experienced hobbyists about their thoughts on the subject. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Diplomacy World just released its 158th quarterly issue, and this one is truly stocked full of outstanding diplomacy content. The hobby's flagship publication includes this time classic Lou Pulsifer advice on negotiation theory, tournament reports and previews for upcoming events, a dynamite set of 3 interviews conducted by Randy Lawrence Hurt with Steve Hogue, Cameron Higby, and Ben Kelman, as well as features of the Great Game variant, hobby history, and the ethical considerations of post-game discussions or after-action reports. If you have not already visited diplomacyworld.net to download this latest issue and to browse previous issues of the magazine, you owe it to yourself to do it. So go do it right now. Go ahead. I'll wait. Oh, who am I kidding? I'm not waiting. Siobhan Nolan has just won the Cascadia tournament in Vancouver over July 9th and 10th, besting a field of diplomacy players from across North America and from the United Kingdom. She repeated as champ since she also won the same event in 2020. Riaz Varani of Vancouver took second, with Saren Kwok from the UK coming in third in this annual event run by Chris Brand. It's usually held in January but was moved to July this year due to pandemic concerns. Siobhan Nolan captured the crown on the strength of dominating board tops as Russia and then Turkey in the first 2 rounds of the event, which of course you can see for yourself in the full coverage that we at DBN broadcast live on Sunday, July 10th. You haven't seen it yet? Lucky for you, a link is provided below in the show notes. And folks, the summertime stretch of face-to-face tournaments is not yet over. The Boston Massacre is up next, held this year August 12th through 14th in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and run again by veteran GM Alex Maslow. You should also consider signing up for Chicago's Weaselmoot event in late September and the World DipCon in early November in Vermont. Links are all provided below. One of the things I like to do here on Deadline is to keep you abreast of how diplomacy is utilized in the worlds of academia and technological research. A paper that is about to be presented at a future conference of the Association of the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence describes the use of what game theorists call a regret minimization algorithm to analyze a set of diplomacy games using, and here's where this gets really fun, greedy weights as a superior method to other algorithms. Honestly, how can greed not be good, at least in the context of diplomacy? 2 diplomacy hobbyists who work in Facebook's AI research area, Adam Lehrer and Noam Brown, team up for this paper with Harvard University's Hu Zhang. In utilizing this approach, they're finding a Nash equilibrium in diplomacy games. They also document the extensive history of diplomacy being used in similar research going back to at least 1988. Let me say that the paper linked below is still preliminary, with the final version not to be published until after the conference, but it's still a rip-roaring read. See the link below. Folks, COVID gave us very little of value except for the invention of virtual face to face as a new mode of diplomacy play. During the lockdown, many face to face tournaments became virtual ones. But now, with restrictions largely lifted and face to face back on the menu, the chance for virtual play has been lessened. But if you're missing your fix, or you want to try this exciting new method of play for the first time, you are in luck. The Summer Classic is coming up very soon, with 6 preliminary rounds to be held July 22nd through 24th on the VWDC Discord server. You can play up to 4 of those 6, with start times being set conveniently for anyone on the planet. The top board is to be played the following weekend for those that qualify. Go for the glory and the DB&I points by signing up using the link below. Now let's take a trip around the various websites and YouTube channels for the content providers we call our DBN media partners. Last month on Deadline, I reported on DARPA's use of diplomacy to study communication patterns. The latest episode of the Diplomacy Games podcast has Australian hosts Amby and Kaner interviewing the leader of DARPA's initiative. His name is Tejas Patel. They talk about the goals and methods of his program, which is known in the agency as Project Shade. I kid you not. In the July 1st edition of the Diplomacy Briefing newsletter, Marcus Zylstra and Karthik Kanath explained the newest mode of diplomacy play that's been invented, a 5-minute turn version of online play called Bliss Press. They also talk about how it dovetails with the latest version of webdiplomacy.com's user interface. And then Marcus released a new video on his DiploStretch channel on YouTube in collaboration with another content provider, Florida Man. They play through a game of Blitz Press for our viewing enjoyment. You can find the links to these diplomacy gems below and check out the full list of the media partners at the North American Diplomacy Federation website, thenadf.org. As most of you know, the Diplomacy Broadcast Network Invitational Tournament is held in February, with 28 top players from the previous season's diplomacy action competing in a virtual face-to-face event consisting of preliminary rounds for the chance to make the top board. We call that top board the Super 7, with the eventual winner being awarded the Cowhammer Cup. What you may not know is that DBN's Countdown show, which reports on the race for a berth in that 28-person field, has just released its first episode of the season on July 8th, right here on this same YouTube channel. Hosts Brian Pravel and Zachary Moore do their thing, showing the current DB&I standings, forecasting their picks for players they expect to break into the Invitational, even if they're not currently near the breakpoint. And they also list events and leagues one could utilize to achieve more DB&I points. Winners of the qualifying tournament and league events from the face-to-face, virtual face-to-face, and extended deadline formats will achieve an automatic bid to the DB&I. So far, that list includes Ed Sullivan, Brandon Fogel, and Tanya Gill. The remainder of the invites will be based on overall season points. It's hype time. The DB&I race is on. Watch the show using the link below. Of course, the DB&I is hardly limited to North American players, even if the 3 qualifiers so far are all North Americans. Indeed, the inaugural event, held in February 2021, was won by Australian Peter McNamara, with the 2022 DB&I top board featuring Saren Kwok from the UK and Frenchman Nicolas Taillet. There are at least 2 upcoming opportunities for our European brothers and sisters to compete for DB&I points. The 2022 European Diplomacy Championships, called EuroDipCon, is being held on September 9th through 11th in conjunction with the Swiss Championships in Sion. You can email swissdiplomacychampionship@gmail.com, and Swiss is spelled SUISSED, for more information on that event. 2 weeks later, a new British event in Chesterfield, Derbyshire, called SpireCon debuts, this time September 24th and 25th. It represents the first face-to-face diplomacy event held in the United Kingdom for some time. On that one, you can email Jen, Jen, at spirecon.uk for additional details on that exciting diplomacy opportunity. It's being run by longtime player Chris Woolger. And now it's time for a segment we call My Favorite Things. We'll interview a diplomacy player about that person's diplomacy journey and then talk about something of particular interest to that hobbyist, whether or not related to diplomacy. This month, we talked to former Windy City Weasel and 2018 Weasel Royale champ Ali Adib, who is interested this month in helping others get better at the game. I got his thoughts about what steps you can take to improve your play and, more importantly, have more fun while you play. Ali, welcome to Deadline.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, David.
Sure. Tell us a little bit first about where you are, what you do, and how you got into the game.
Sure. So I am now mostly based in Los Angeles, in Southern California, a little bit in New York, but mostly here, as long as I'm not out of town, in the middle of nowhere. And the way I got into diplomacy, I used to play Risk when I was back in Tehran. And I remember one time one of my friends made fun of Risk for all the risk probabilities and then told us about this other game, Diplomacy. Years later, when I was in London, I tried to get a bunch of my friends together to play it. It was miserable because they didn't want to spend that much time, but I had to play, and the only way was to make them come and try it out with me. And that didn't quite work. We played, I think, twice and never got to a good point in the game and we never got the hold of it. And then eventually when I moved to Chicago, I realized there's this active club, the Windy City Weasels, which I owe my ability to play diplomacy to them, that they're pretty active, they're into it, you don't need to convince them, come sit around the board for hours for no particular purpose. And that's how I got into it. And I started playing consistently I would say I played like once a month or once every other month for a few years. And then eventually I became one of the people helping organize the games and stuff. Although I didn't do as much as some of the other people. So kudos to them. And the people who started it and kept him going. I need to give a shout out to Jimo Kelly that is not as active anymore, but he was one of the reasons that club kept going for years.
I was literally chatting with Jim about 10 minutes ago.
Really?
So he's still kicking around, but not really much in diplomacy, though.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I hope he's doing well.
He is doing very well. Yeah. You and I recently had a discussion about ways in which an aspiring diplomat could improve their play of the game. So let's first talk about tactics. What is your best advice regarding how to better one's tactics in diplomacy?
I mean, for me, the journey was partially understanding the map better. And by that, I don't mean memorizing where everything is just understanding what position is versus center count and understanding how you hold your line, what different lines mean, what they can do for you. And I think a lot of it comes from practice. I think gunboats have been really helpful to me. One of the benefits of the gunboats is it's a long game. And you, when you play a face-to-face game, there's an end point because people have lives. Whereas like a gunboat game, we can put one order in and then it can go on for a month and it doesn't really interrupt your life. But you get to see so many different probabilities and possibilities and see different complicated situations as far as tactics. And it helps you like improve your tactics game. Brandon Vogel started a gunboat tournament that was really helpful in also helping me improve my tactics. I was a decent enough player at that point, but it still helped me a lot. And I think sandboxes are helpful. And I think being able to predict what possibilities can emerge out of a complicated situation, what kind of supports can be cut or given, who's going to cut what support, what does that mean for the moves that are going to happen, what bounces are possible, what convoys are possible, and then just being able to think of that in under pressure in a short amount of time before you decide about your moves. So I think, that's quite key.
Expand a little bit on your concept of center count versus position, because I think that's a concept that players really should try to grasp.
Yeah, that's one of the things that new players fall for very often, is that someone may offer you one or two immediate center counts and it may look like you're more powerful. But the thing is, as long as you cannot hold the line, as long as you cannot hold your centers, having them doesn't really matter that much, unless it's the last year in the game and there's a deadline that's about to come and the game's about to be over. Yeah, then go crazy, grab as many dots, as we call them, dot grabbing, grab as many dots as you want. But otherwise, if it's a longer game, if there's more to come, position is quite important. And also another thing you and I talked about before is early leader or early board topper syndrome. People that tend to fall for that they want to just get big very quickly. If it's a short game, maybe, but if it's a longer game, the chances are people are going to go after you if you're the first board topper. And maybe trying to build alliances and trust and position, maybe it's more beneficial to you than trying to start getting a lot of dots early on in the game.
That makes sense. Let's move on to the strategic aspects of diplomacy. What do you think the importance of tempo is in developing your plan strategically?
I think that again, I'm not the ultimate expert on this, but as far as I understand, my limited understanding is it really depends on the duration type of the game. If it's a bar game, if it's like a long game, if it's like a game with no ending until everyone agrees to draw. And I think that the tempo, the timing the timing of your stab need to be set based on the type of game you're playing. And you need to be able to predict what's going to come out of when you stab an ally. Sometimes it's a longer game, and I personally wait longer to go for that because, yes, you may go for your opponent and stab them and they can't come after you because they don't have position. But the thing is, that creates a vacuum for other people to either go after you or start growing elsewhere in the map. Whereas if you wait for a situation that no one else really has that possibility of growing that big, and you would be the best, the top favorite of winning the game, then that may be better timing. And I think sometimes in some games, if you have quick tempo, it actually really helps you. It really depends on who's on the board, what kind of settings you're in, and how long the game is going to last, or how many diplomacy years. Yeah.
Sometimes when you're talking to other players, there's jargon involved, terminology. When you're talking about strategic concepts or alliance structures, how important do you think that is? And what can someone do to get more familiar with that jargon or terminology?
I think for the terminology, listening and reading. So listening around the board when other people talk about it, and then reading some of the literature can be helpful, I think. And there's not a ton of it. You can easily grasp it. It just requires a bit of attention. And I think listening has been helpful for me.
How valuable do you think the literature online is in general?
I would say trust it with a grain of salt. The data samples that they use are limited. They belong to a specific group of people and a specific period of time. So some of the more statistical data that come out and say, for example, the well-being of Germany depends on the well-being of Austria. Well, even if that's statistically true, it's not true 100% of the times. Sometimes there's other situations in the map or around the board that change that. Also, we don't know if that's still the case, the way people play the game today versus 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But definitely there's value in reading other people's experiences. And I think just take them with a grain of salt.
That's fair.
I think getting feedback from experienced players who are actually around you is sometimes more valuable in some ways, because it's, unwritten literature that is available to you right there.
It's true, and it's interactive.
It is, yeah. You can ask questions, and I think, listening is helpful.
So after tactics and strategy, the third leg of the diplomacy stool is sometimes called negotiation. Given that we all come from different backgrounds, different personalities, what's your best advice to people about this aspect of the game, the negotiation aspect?
I would say people should be a little stoic about it and work with what they have, the toolbox they have. My personal experience was that I realized after a while that some people are more charming and can convince people to do crazy things. And I think for me, I couldn't always do that, whether I was too blunt or whether I was English second language or I had an accent. I think sometimes people talk to me and they don't know another person just like me to be able to predict what I mean or what I'm going to do about what I'm saying or relate to me in that sense. So realizing that that's something that I may not have in my toolbox, I carry a different mythological baggage than other people that are playing with me. So being able to realize that and then relying on other things that work for you. For example, like I sometimes would try to be more tangible with the things I would say on the map. Once I understood the map better, of course. Early on, I made proposals that were not sound. But now that I play better, I think it's realizing what I can work with. Sometimes I build long alliances that I can rely on them. It gives me a sense of safety in the game, and then you can go after them when you can. It will help if they don't know the map or tactics as good as you. So yeah, it's working with what you have, understanding your toolbox, and also I think reading the room pretty well, understanding what other people's toolboxes are.
So, some of us are direct in negotiation. Some of us are more circuitous, I guess would be the word. What's your view on the effectiveness of that, one way or the other?
I mean, we're people. So at the end of the day, I think it comes down to how it's perceived, how it's received. Sometimes it may be too abrasive and too harsh. Sometimes someone like me may actually like it if it's more forward. Again, like everyone speaks of a different, reference point in mythological baggage. So I think understanding what works with who and what's people's motives when they also come to you is going to be helpful. Yeah.
Do you
Again,
have
there's no absolute answer, I think, to that. I think there's no easy answer to say like, oh, it's better to be forward. It really is contextual, I think.
What is the relative importance, in your view, of initiating ideas and proposals yourself versus listening for and reading other players' intentions or motivations? What's the thought there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question for me, particularly because I can come off more pushy. I like to be in control of things as opposed to like see how they go and jump on the wagon. But I think what I've learned is that pushiness, that being the person proposing the ideas all the time, can actually make you seem like you have ulterior motive because you're trying too hard. Whereas like if you're more passive, people maybe they would trust you more. There's a possibility. So I think again, this is another answer that is just about the context, just about who's around the board, the situation on the board, where you're positioned on the map. But I think for me, sometimes I'm more pushy, it backfires. Sometimes you're more passive, it backfires. So it's about reading the room and trying to figure out what works with who and what works in what kind of game, what kind of context.
That's really good advice so far. Do you have any final thoughts for our audience, whether they're learning the game or they already know the game, or they're trying to get better? What's your final advice to them?
Well, I guess one of the things is timing is really key. I think you can't control your allies, or because your allies eventually are your enemies. There's a conflict of interest. So, but your timing is more controllable. So that's one thing people can focus on. Tactics are something strategy and negotiation are somewhat out of our control, but tactics could be learned. So that's another area people can focus on. It's not a be all do all, but it's helpful. And I think another thing for me, a big thing for me is, you're playing with 7 players. It's not chess. You're not playing another person. So no matter how good you are or how good you play, you may still not win the game. And that is important to realize, that there are games that I lose and I'm happy. And there are games that are board topped and I'm unhappy about some of the moves I made because I think there was an element of recklessness to it. And yeah, I think the other thing is at the end of the day, it's a game. I really lose track of everything when I'm playing diplomacy or like online or face to face, and something can pass by me and I would not even notice it. It's kind of a state of flow, and I quite like it in a way. But at the same time, as much as I get lost in the game, I think people need to realize at the end of the day, it's just a game, and it's not the entire universe, even when you're playing it. So, and I guess. It's good to have fun, and fun doesn't always come in winning. Sometimes the fun is in having a thrilling game.
That's a great way to end your conversation with me on this. Ali Adib, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
And now for this month's panel discussion. Playing the small time is an experience we all have in diplomacy more often than we'd like to admit. If you end up with fewer centers than most of your competitors on the board and you don't see a path forward either to topping the board or otherwise achieving a really good result, what do? What becomes your motivation for your moves and your negotiations? Should you just try to survive, or are there other goals you can and should try to achieve? Let's discuss this with former Boston Massacre tournament director and now North Carolina resident Randy Lawrence Hurt, who just placed fourth at the last DixieCon. We'll talk to DBN personality Karthik Kanath of California, himself with top boards and tournament wins to his credit, and with Timothy Crosby of Florida, who is currently leading the standings of the Virtual Diplomacy League. Randy, let's start with you. Tell our audience who you are, what you do, and how you got into diplomacy.
Sure. Well, as Dave mentioned, my name's Randy. I was one of the primary organizers of the diplomacy hobby in Boston until I moved to North Carolina early last year. So it's been about a year and a half now down south. For my day job, I do regulatory compliance for an insurance company, which is just slightly less exciting than it sounds. But my free time involve playing board games as well as acting, music, a lot of other stuff. I got into diplomacy via board games, actually, back when I was around 14 or so almost 20 years ago now. I was playing a lot of Axis and Allies, Battle Cry, Risk 2210, those old Avalon Hill games, and discovered diplomacy. And then also quickly discovered that I didn't have a friend group large enough or dedicated enough to play the game. So I discovered email play through the Diplomatic Pouch, which I imagine an old timer like David remembers. Then I played online for years until around 2008 or 9 was my first face-to-face tournament, Boston Massacre. And since then, I've played pretty much entirely face-to-face tournaments since. And I also, for the last couple of years, I've served on the board of the North American Diplomacy Federation.
All right, thanks. You could have actually gone out and recruited more friends instead of going online, but that's fine. I appreciate the honest answer. Karthik, same information from you, please.
So my name is Karthik, as David mentioned. I am a software engineer in San Diego, California. I got into diplomacy first by playing with some friends in high school. We all played on Play Diplomacy for the first time there, while having press basically done in between classes and basically just throughout our entire lives in a freshman year of high school. But I got frustrated by the fact that we could only play like a certain number of games for free on Play Diplomacy. So I moved to Web Diplomacy, the #1 site for playing diplomacy online.
Here we go.
And I mean, the rest is history. So I started there in 2011, 10 years ago when I was 14, and took a brief sabbatical before joining the virtual face-to-face community, and then eventually the face-to-face community at Carnage for the first time when it was NA DipCon. And hope to be there for World DipCon this year as well. So, I mean, I run the gamut from online to virtual to face-to-face. All diplomacy is good diplomacy, as David Hood would say. So I recommend everyone joins all forms of diplomacy and has a great time there. And
couldn't have said it better myself. Tim, over to you. Name, rank, and serial number.
All right. My name's Tim. I've been playing diplomacy probably 10 or 12 years now. I saw it played in college, and when I heard a game was coming up, I wormed my way in and played one game there. Then, this was back before internet. Then it was probably 6 or 7 years. The internet came to my town, and I found Cat 23. If you remember that, David, from CompuServe, I think it was.
Yep.
And I got into that and moved over to Diplomatic Corps. And I think I played somewhere else. I play on Play Diplomacy now. And for the last 3 years, I've been pretty much virtual face-to-face only. Played a couple of tournaments, joined the Windy City Weasels, and currently I'm in VDL as well as Tour Britain, looking for that chance to get back into DBNI. Got some unfinished business there.
Well, let me stay with you, Tim. If you're playing a smaller position in diplomacy, what realistic goals should that small-time player have, you think?
Yeah, when I find myself in that small player position, the very first thing I do is I remind myself this is only a game. We all know these games get very competitive and they get emotionally charged. So that reminder just gives me a chance to reset and think clearly. Now, I look for my goal as a small power. Well, it really depends on what kind of game you're playing in. If it's a tournament, it's a league game, or just a weekend fun game. It's weird to say, but the type of game does influence how I play the small power. If I have future considerations to take into account, mostly it happens in leagues where you're playing 8 to 10 rounds and you're seeing the same people over and over again. But ultimately, personally, I strive for surviving the game no matter the setting. But when scoring is involved, I'm fighting for that non-zero score.
Karthik, when a small time player is trying to determine how to play their game, should they always try to maximize the score for that particular game, or do you think it's acceptable to ignore that in favor of motives like revenge or teaching someone a lesson or king making?
So I think things like pure revenge are somewhat silly, but I think teaching a lesson is generally justified. There are times when someone will dot you while you're holding a stalemate line or across a red line. And in order to maintain credibility, one would need to basically, throw a solo or punish the other player in such a way that they know going forward that the cost of crossing that red line or the cost of stabbing someone who's holding a stalemate line for you is losing the game for good. And teaching those lines and showing that threats do have value can be very, very important. But it's important above all else to hold the balance. One cannot be wantonly throwing away solos or just giving away games for no reason. It's very, very important for all players to know that games should be taken very seriously and positions to be maintained to the best of their ability unless that red line is crossed. So long as a solo can be prevented and it makes sense to do so, one should strive to maintain and maximize their score to the best of their ability. But there does come time, of course, when that line does get crossed, and one should teach a lesson to the best of their ability.
I can attest to that because we played, Karthik, you and I played a game. I think it was Massacre 2021, where that's exactly how it finished out. And the rest of the board was very unhappy because it was very, very late in the day.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, they made a mistake. This was, I think, when Farron got a well-deserved solo.
I won't argue that, but
people made mistakes on this board, and the result showed what happened.
Well, that's the kind of discussion we want from a panel discussion. Randy, let's go over to you and save us from this. I guess the most traditional role that is played by small players on the board is the janissary or the puppet to a larger power. Do you think survival is the only purpose of playing that strategy, or can there be other goals to pursue?
Well, there definitely can be other goals, but obviously survival has to be the most fundamental one because you can't accomplish anything else if you don't survive. So your primary goal, if you're going to keep on playing, which I think you always should, is survival. But I think there are very legitimate secondary goals, and I'm going to disagree with Karthik on this a bit because I think that pure vengeance can be an absolutely acceptable goal. If you believe that someone has wronged you and you can effectively janissary for someone else and achieve just pure vengeance against the person who's wronged you, I think that can be acceptable both in game and it can actually be very beneficial, strategically speaking, in the tournament itself. There is a power to being known as someone who will declare a blood feud against the first person who attacks you, and if you're a good enough player, actually pull it off and accomplish something with that vengeance. There have been players that I've been on board with that I've just decided I didn't want to attack because I knew that they would be they are good, they know what they're doing, and they would spend their entire game trying to ruin my game. So I do think from a strategic standpoint for the tournament, there are definitely benefits to just pure vengeance being your motivation when you're a small power. In addition to that, I mean, obviously there can be other tournament rewards if you outlast other players. Maybe there's a survivalist award, or depending on the scoring system, lasting longer might actually make a significant difference for your final score at the end of the tournament. And if that's the sort of thing that matters to you, it's the sort of thing that you should try to maximize. And then, I mean, there can also be a legitimate goal of trying to push the power that you're janissarying for into a solo, whether that's linked to the vengeance motive or for some reason it actually helps your score. Maybe they have no chance of winning the tournament, but a solo would catapult you into the top 3 somehow by knocking someone else out. That can be a legitimate goal.
All right, I appreciate that. Karthik, let's go back to you for a minute. In the Avalon Hills Gamer Guide to Diplomacy from 1979, the author, Rod Walker, says that only immature players throw away their positions just because they have few or very small number of centers. Do you agree with that? And tell us why or why not.
Yes and no. So I think there are very justifiable motives in throwing away one's position. And I think Randy actually did explain it well. There are positions like, which you will be in where it makes sense to say like, look, I'm going to do what it takes to show you that what you did was so wrong that you will never, ever consider doing it again to me, right? If you wrong me this hard again, like you will pay the consequences and you will suffer. And I have to admit that I did do it, I think, to Randy one time. And I think showing that is a very important lesson, right? Like, showing that you have the power to affect such circumstance in someone is a very, very effective lesson to teach them, right? And showing that, hey, I can throw a solo, I can eliminate you, I can do various other things when given the position to do so, even despite being on 1, 2, 3, or 4 centers, despite only being on so many units. The game is diplomacy, not tactics, as David Hood constantly says, correctly, may I add. So being able to show that you have the diplomatic capability to eliminate someone with very few units is a very, very effective show of power. And teaching these people a lesson is not immature, but actually can serve your tournament interest going forward. And I think I have been served personally well by throwing positions away, and in some cases throwing away an entire solo, which is causing defeat for the entire board and giving a win by the rule book to another person. Because I've shown in the future that that is what happens when you do those silly things. And people have responded, at least as far as I've seen, favorably to that, recognizing there are lines that cannot be crossed. And in doing so, creating positions where people are willing to work with me when I'm a small power and not take advantage of me as some other people are done when they get whittled out of a draw, which can be very unfortunate, especially in tournaments like DiftyCon, which are draw-based.
An important caveat to all of that, and I agree with everything Karthik just said, but is when you're doing that, when you're a small power and you're pursuing extreme vengeance or pushing someone for a solo, everyone should understand why you're doing it.
Correct.
And you shouldn't just be acting like you're just mad and you're taking it out on the board, and you don't want to be immature about it, because then it is an immature play. But if there are obvious, whether it's game reasons or strategic from a tournament perspective or metagaming reasons, whatever you want to call them, if there are obvious reasons, or if they're not obvious, you say them to everyone, you make it clear what your reasons are, then I think that's a perfectly mature, reasonable way to play the game.
Exactly. Go with what Randy said. It's very, very important that you explain your rationale and that you have a very, very solid, grounded rationale for whatever you're doing when you decide to throw away your position. Just simply flipping over the board or walking away from your position or throwing, as I mentioned in the first statement I made, just wantonly throwing the game is very immature and very, very silly. It's very important that when you do throw the game, that it's justified and you explain that justification to others so they can understand what your rules are and what your perspective on how to play the game is. That way they can react and understand where you're coming from. Because if they just think, oh, this guy is a moron and he's just giving away the game for no reason because he's a child, then that's going to end very, very poorly for you in the future. But if they understand, okay, look, this guy has a reason for what he did, that's probably going to work well for you in the future because they know what bright lines not to cross and they'll respond favorably to that.
Folks in the audience, just for your benefit, there will be a link to that Gamer's Guide article down in the show notes that we're going to that'll accompany this broadcast. Randy, let's go back to that Gamer's Guide article. It lists the puppet ploy, which we've already talked about a little bit. It also lists something that you can do called the leadership ploy, in which a small power tries to form coalitions with other powers on the board in order to achieve shared goals. So let's talk about that for a minute. What sorts of ploys have you seen small timers try, or that you've tried yourself, other than throwing the game, which we've already talked about in some detail?
Sure. Well, obviously, the most common one would be a stop the leader or stop the solo. Um, Even if you're only a small power on just a couple of centers, you can still be incredibly influential in keeping someone from winning the game, getting to 18. If you've got a center, and you could be a one center power in Munich, and you could be the reason that someone does not solo. And if you are also very tactically sound, you could be responsible for shoring up some other part of the line. Or if you're very diplomatically good, if for whatever reason you've got the kind of personality that persuades people to do stuff, you can be very influential in shifting the dynamics of the board to stop the solo or stop the leader or create some other kind of result. On a related note, there could be metagaming related ploys. If you know certain, maybe there's multiple powers on the board that are all vying for a high position in the tournament, and you know that. And if tactically speaking or diplomatically speaking, you can elevate one of them over the other, and in so doing also lift yourself, that can definitely be something that you could pull off with very few centers.
Going off of what Randy said, I would say that there is an instance where Chris Martin was on one center that was not relevant to the stalemate line at all. But he was able to tell the three other powers on his side of the line that I'm the only person that can write the orders necessary to prevent the solo. So you need to keep me alive so that I can tell you what orders to write. And in doing so, basically secure himself a place in the draw, despite having no right by virtue of his center or unit position to have that place in the draw. And then going off of that, but you don't only need to be preventing the solo. If you can give yourself, give the other person who you're janissarying for, as you mentioned, tactics necessary to help them grow, you can help them, you can survive on one center, which can be easily eliminated and grow as well. I can think of a game in, I think, Tour of Britain, where I was janissarying for Chris Wardy, and I was in Sevastopol as my final center. Very easily taken off. I mean, not important to the line at all. But I told Wardy, hey, if you keep me alive, I will give you the orders necessary to get you into a huge position, and I will never stab you. I'll do what's necessary to help you into that position that you deserve. And I think I got him to like a 12 or 13 center position by the end of the game by just telling him here, I will be your tactical advisor for this game. So it's not only just what your units can do or how you can janissary for them or so on and so forth, but if you can give them tactical advice and tactical leadership for the coalition that you're working with, that can be huge for surviving and establishing a good score in a game.
That's very modern of you, Karthik, to hire yourself out as a consultant. I mean, that's what people do. That's what people do nowadays. Yeah. Tim, let me go over to you for just a minute. The Gamer's Guide also has a part of this section about playing the small time where it says that there is almost no such thing as a hopeless situation in diplomacy. Do you agree with that?
I do, mostly because of the term almost. I mean, if you're sitting in Brest with an army and you're surrounded by EG, there's probably not much you can do at that point, and they just take you up. But in other situations, I mean, I ask myself, well, what can my use be, and who am I most important to? Am I sitting somewhere important? Can I tip the balance of the board, as we talked about earlier? And in those questions, you can find a reason to have a conversation with those big players. That's what I find too. It's when you're a small player in a big stakes board, sometimes you don't get the time to talk to those players. And so that's why I think it's find a way to approach them. Go after them, follow them to their room, say, hey, can I just get a couple of minutes? And don't wait for them to come to you. Make them see that how you can be important to them. If I could relate a little story, I took over an English position. It was a extended deadline game, and England abandoned. So when I took over the game, I don't recall the year, but it was early. France was in the Channel and the Irish Sea. Germany was in the North Sea and had an army in Wales. It looked really, really hopeless. Russia was in a position to knock my army out of Norway with his new St. Pete North Coast fleet. So that was an important point. So I implored Russia, hey, said, listen, leave me alone. He said no. I'm like, okay, fine. So I approached EG and suggested, hey, if you take me out, you're not going to have the strength to hold off this Russia, because obviously he's going to build another fleet in the north, and that'll be the end of it. You'll be fighting me, and you'll just be walking across the top of the board. So after several messages back and forth with the German and the English or the French, they convoyed that German army back to the mainland and pulled the fleet out of the Irish Sea, and Russia knocked me out. And my next message to him was very sweet. It was very fun, and he ended up being eliminated from the game as we went along. So he was not happy, and my point is there are almost no hopeless positions, because if you look at that, it's like, wow, why would anybody want to take that position? But like I said, you got to talk to people and find a way to make yourself important.
Something to keep in mind is that the number of centers that you have or other powers have often matters a lot less than the relationships at the table and how the board has and the tournament has progressed so far. So don't think about the centers. Don't necessarily, particularly when you only have a few and the tactics don't matter. Think about what you can do in terms of your diplomacy. I mean, that's the name of the game, after all.
Randy, let's look at the issue from the other side. If you're one of the larger powers, how could you harness the needs and desires of those small-time players to advance your own cause?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing you have to do is talk to them. You have to understand their motivations and learn how to work with them and fit them into your broader goals. If they just want vengeance on someone, be the one who can give it to them. If they just want to survive, be the one who can keep them alive on a dot for 6 years. Figure out what they want. Tell them that you'll give it to them, and then actually give it to them so long as they're continuing to do what you want them to do.
Tim, how do you determine when it's time, if you've got that situation, how do you determine when it's time to attack and kill that small timer instead of using them as your puppet or as a junior partner?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I know.
I look at a couple of things. It's like, are those units necessary anymore to meet your goals, or can you get to where you need to go without them? Can I replace those units with my own? That's something I really look at. It's like, all right, can I slide my units and pull their units out and still maintain that strategy or tactic that I'm looking for? Or can I slide in another ally to take those units, to have a broader control of the board? Maybe 2 medium-sized powers will take out the small one. Another thing I have to consider is, again, scoring. Does taking them out bring the game to an agreeable end without tipping the balance to one side or the other? We can just straight up end the game here. If so-and-so's out, we can all agree to the draw. And again, am I likely facing this person later in a league or in a game? So maybe it's better to leave them in. Those are odd considerations, but I mean, that's just the way tournament play goes. It's like, okay, I'm gonna leave you in here as we go around to the next game. I can say, hey, remember that time I didn't take you out and you got a few extra points? Well, and it plays both ways. Some will do that to me too. It's like, hey, I remember a game you didn't take me out, so we can start a relationship based on that.
Fair.
Something that is important, I think, to keep in mind as a larger power, though, is if you've got a solo in the back of your mind, which you always should, it is often easier to get up to 18 with more powers on the board than fewer. And if you're eliminating powers just willy-nilly because, hey, I can take that dot and replace it with my own, that might be true, but the chances are good that by simplifying the board, you have actually made it harder for yourself to get that solo.
Right.
Karthik, I was going to ask you that question. How important do you think smaller powers are to either achieving a solo or stopping a solo?
Right. No, I think smaller powers are hugely important on both ends of the deal. In terms of achieving a solo, the more complicated a board, the harder it is for the entire board to come together and stop the solo, because people have competing interests, right? So if you are trying to balance 4 players' competing interests together in order to stop a solo, that's way, way, way harder than trying to balance 2 players' competing interests to stop that same solo, right? So you may have a turkey that's like stuck in the corner, and they may think, hey, if I play this right, I can get up to 7, 8, 9, 10 centers while still stopping the solo. and take a chance on it and make that play. The downside is this: if they guess wrong, they'll end up giving away the solo. Some turkeys may take that risk, some turkeys may not. But by keeping all these players in the game and using your diplomacy to make sure the players on the other side of the board are staying alive, or the players on your side of the board are staying alive, you make the board more complicated and make it harder for all the other players to actually come together and stop the solo. And then by the same token, if you are one of the players trying to lead a coalition to stop the solo, managing the interests and desires of these smaller players, some of whom may not be motivated by score anymore, is very, very important, right? If you can tell them, hey, I can take out that person you want to get revenge on, provided that you contribute your units to stopping the solo, you're far more likely to succeed than if you're just making purely score-based or purely rational agreements that some players may not care for anymore. Because when it comes to diplomacy, you have to recognize the fact that players may have different rationales and different goals than you think they ought to have. And if you take those into consideration, you will succeed and generally advance the goals that you want to have. And if you fail to take those into consideration, then you'll be woefully surprised when things do not go the way that you expect them to. And suddenly you have these players who you thought you made rational arguments to, deciding to give away the solo to someone else, despite you thinking you made good arguments, because they simply had different goals than you had, and you simply never calibrated your arguments to those goals. So managing the relationship that you have with smaller powers, whether you're trying to create a solo or stop a solo, are really, really important to either your objectives, either as a coalition leader against a solo or as a soloist trying to create that solo opportunity.
Tim,
and also to add to that, there are times you just have to accept you're just getting knocked out. That's the way it goes. There isn't any argument that you're going to make. You just said, okay, this game didn't work out.
Well, while you're on the subject, give us your final thoughts before you get knocked out of this panel discussion. Give me your final thoughts for the audience.
My final thoughts were, when you do find yourself into this position, and we're all gonna be there sometime, pay attention to what's going on the board. Always stay involved and look for that way to make yourself important to someone. Move yourself into an important spot on the board, like Munich or Silesia, somewhere on a line, or somewhere where eventually you're going to influence the balance on either side of that board and say, look, you take me out, this is what's going to happen. You keep me in, this is what's going to happen. And sell your position on the board. I mean, many times I've been that player in Munich. I've been Italy in Munich. I've been Austria in Munich. But just being in Munich, neither side wants the other side to have that spot. So you get saved. And another time, I think I was in Silesia, sitting on the line. I was in Austria. And nobody can take me out because it tipped the balance. But stay involved.
Karthik, tell these folks out there why it's fun to play the small time.
Sure. I mean, I think it's an incredibly fun position to be the smaller power because it really forces you to think about the board as a whole, because you don't have the advantages having like the units you can write tactical orders for, right? When you're the big power, you can just say, who needs diplomacy? I can just tactically outplay these people and run for the solo, run for whatever objective I have, get the score I need to win the tournament, right? But when you're behind, you need to get really, really creative diplomatically in order to achieve survival and sometimes the goals that you want to achieve. And it's very, very important above all else to know what your personal goals are and then know what the goals of other players are. For example, during the Nexus semifinals, during the Nexus preliminaries, there was a game where I was working with some anonymous players at the time, and I knew what I needed to do in order to make the semifinals. By working as a Turkish janissary, I managed to ask at first for 2 centers, provided that I provide my fleet to help the RA achieve their goals, Russian-Austrian alliance. Eventually, I parlayed that into 4 centers. And then I was like, hey, my squad kind of needs 6 centers. And then it kind of needs 8 centers. And then by the end of the game, I basically managed to work myself into an 8-center position as Turkey, despite being a janissary the entire game, without stabbing either Russia or Austria, because I knew exactly what they needed in order to make semifinals as well. And then by the same token, there are other games where you're like, hey, if I can convince this person to stab their ally, not only can I be the small-time player serving as a useful role, but I can actually work myself back into the game. There was a game where I was playing with Morgante and Wardy, where I convinced Wardy, after he basically took me within a year of my life. If he had saved Morgante, chances are I died the very, very following year. I convinced him to stab Morgante, and then in doing so, create a position where I could not only come back from a dead Austrian position, but come over to take into a board top. So what I like to say as a small power is never say never. So long as you're alive, you have a unit to play with, and you are able to talk to all the other players on the board, you have a chance to work yourself back into the board top. So I always say, keep your eye on the score as in your number one goal. If you can't do that, find a secondary goal that can allow you to do well. And then 3, always find a way to be useful to others, because you can always find a way to survive if you're clever enough. And so long as you can do those things, I think you'll find a great way to play as a small power and survive and have fun.
Where there's life, there's hope.
Exactly.
Last word to you, Randy. Tell us something big about playing small.
Always keep in mind that every power on the board starts the game with just a few centers, and one of them always ends up winning. So just because you only have a couple of centers doesn't mean that you can't have big goals. So whether that's winning the survivalist award, if that exists, whether it's working your way into the draw, whether it's getting revenge on the person who wronged you, have a goal and play towards it. Maybe it won't work out, but if you don't have a goal, you're definitely not going to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
All right, fellas, I appreciate all your comments. You've inspired me, and you all know what that probably means in terms of musical interludes getting ready to happen here right after this panel discussion. So thanks for being on the show, and keep playing those small-time positions. All right, so let me get this straight. At playing the small time, I should play for revenge, or play for the stalemate line, or play to throw the game past the stalemate line. All right, I got it. Let's put it in music. I am not throwing away my dot. I am not throwing away my dot. Hey, yo, I've lost most of my country, but still scrappy and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my dot. I'ma get me a deal with another player. I probably shouldn't tell you about this other layer. The problem is I got you, Austrian betrayer. I gotta holler with every word. I'm a slayer, I'm a diamond in the rough, an Italian piece of coal. Trying to reach my goal, revenge is my role. The plan is to fan my spark into a flame. I'll help your enemies, let me spell out their names. They are R-T-F-G-E-F-G-E-R. They are meant to be your destiny of elimination sets me free. So there will be payback for me through my puppetry. I am not throwing away my dot. I am not throwing away my dot. Hey, yo, I've lost most of my country, but still scrapped and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my dot. I am not throwing away my dot. I am not throwing away my dot. Hey, yo, I've lost most of my country, but still hope to get lucky, so I'm not throwing away my dot. Whoa, oh, oh, whoa, whoa, yeah. It might just be slow, but I know I could grow, yeah. Rise up, I might now be on my knees, but rise up. If they listen to my pleas, then rise up. Some more centers I could squeeze, so rise up. My score could still increase. Rise up, Austria, I hope that you might rise up, 'cause you could make it right. Wise up and make a deal, all right? Wise up unless you want to fight. Whoa, stalemate line could be fine. Choice is mine, but no, I won't go with the flow. you should know. I might throw away my dot. Yeah, I might throw away my dot. I've lost myself at center, but don't be in the center. Might throw away my dot. Yep, I might throw away my dot. Yeah, I might throw away my dot. I've lost myself at center, so don't be a dissenter, or I might throw away, I might throw away my dot. Well, thanks, Shot Guy. And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.